I'm FA and I was 33 the night my dad put my grandpa out in a storm. It was a Tuesday in March, the kind of West Texas rain that arrives sideways and lingers for hours. My phone buzzed once, a neighbor I barely knew. "Your granddad's sitting on the porch in this," she wrote. "Bags and all." I was 40 minutes away. I drove it in 30. 8 months earlier, my grandpa had sold his ranch for $1.2 million and handed every cent to my father. He had asked for one thing in return. 3 words: take care of me. What the will reading revealed 3 months later, after he was gone, after the lawyer opened a folder none of us expected, is the part nobody in that room ever saw coming. Including me. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. Quiet stories about family, money, and the people who finally stop apologizing. If a story has ever made you sit perfectly still in your car after you've parked, you're in the right place. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Now, that night when I got him into the truck, he was clutching one thing against his chest. An old weather radio. Let me go back 8 months, because the money came first, and the money explains everything. My grandpa, Harold Anderson, was 80 years old when he sold the ranch. He'd worked that land for 51 years. When the offer came, $1.2 million for the surface claim, he took it. Then he did something I still don't fully understand. He gave all of it to my dad. Not a trust. Not a check with conditions. He wired the entire sum into Roy Anderson's checking account on a Friday afternoon. I was there for the handoff, sitting at my parents' kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold. My dad kept repeating the same thing. "Dad, you don't have to do this." And my grandpa, who never wasted a single word in his life, looked at him across the table and said it plainly, "Take care of me." That was the whole arrangement. A handshake and 3 words. My mother, Linda, had her arms folded the entire time, nodding as though she'd personally negotiated it. I remember thinking it was strange that a man that careful would surrender everything on a promise. So I asked him, "Grandpa, why didn't you put it in writing?" He gave me the slow smile, the one he reserved for when he thought you were almost asking the right question. "Some things you write down, Faye," he said. "Some things you find out." I didn't know what that meant. I assumed it was old man wisdom, the kind that sounds profound and really just means he didn't want to deal with a lawyer. I was wrong about that, the way I was wrong about almost everything that year. He folded his hands over that weather radio on the table and said nothing more. The transfer cleared by Monday. You need to understand who my grandpa was, or none of what follows will land. Harold Anderson was the most frugal, quietly wealthy man in the state of Texas. He patched his work boots with shoe goo until the soles were more adhesive than leather. He drank his coffee from one chipped blue enamel mug, the same one for as long as I could remember, and he washed it by hand every single time. When the truck's AC died, he rolled the windows down for 3 summers rather than pay to fix it. We all believed the ranch was the whole of him. That $1.2 million was Harold's entire life converted to currency. He never corrected us. But every so often, he'd say something that didn't quite fit the man we thought we knew. The afternoon after the wire cleared, I drove him back out to the empty ranch so he could walk the fence line one final time. He stopped at the cattle gate and stared out at the flat, brown expanse of it. "People think it's just dirt," he said. "The land was never just dirt." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. He simply reached for a small brass key on a worn leather cord, the one he carried beneath his shirt, and turned it over in his fingers like a worry stone. I was 33 and freshly humbled. My own startup, an agricultural soil sensor company I'd poured 4 years and every dollar into, had collapsed the spring before. I was doing contract coding out of a 1-bedroom apartment and pretending I had a plan. So when my grandpa talked about dirt that wasn't just dirt, I half listened, the way you do when you're busy failing at your own life. He slid the key back under his collar. We drove home in the heat with the windows down. That brass key became a quiet game between us. He wore it everywhere, even to the dinner table. Once, I asked him directly what it opened. He pinched it through his shirt and grinned. "Key still opens something worth opening," he said. "That's all I'll tell a girl who lost a whole company." Coming from anyone else, it would have stung. From him, it felt almost tender. Harold's way of saying he hadn't written me off, even if I had. He moved into my parents' house in town that week. Roy gave him the back bedroom that used to be my brother Dale's. For about a month, things appeared fine from the outside. Then the phone calls began. My mother would call me, her voice carefully arranged into concern. "Faye, has your grandfather said anything to you about us? About the house?" I'd say no because he hadn't. Linda would go quiet for a beat too long. Well, she'd say he gets confused. We just want to manage things properly. I didn't have a name for it then. I do now. It's the oldest maneuver in elder financial abuse. You isolate the money conversation and keep the responsible relative deliberately in the dark. Then you call it managing. My mother was very skilled at it. She'd grown up with nothing and married into the Andersons expecting more than Harold's frugality ever delivered. 30 years of feeling financially constrained in a family that owned land. When the $1.2 million landed, something in her concluded it was finally, at long last, owed. I didn't recognize the danger in those phone calls. I told myself my parents were simply tired. I told myself that caring for an elderly man was just difficult. I repeated that to myself for weeks, right up until the night the bags went out on the porch in the rain. So now we're back to that Tuesday in March. The rain. The neighbor's text. I left a video call mid-sentence, grabbed my keys, and drove 40 minutes in the dark with the wipers losing the fight the entire way. When I pulled up, my grandpa was sitting on the front steps beneath the porch light. 2 canvas bags beside him, already soaked through. That same weather radio pressed against his chest the way a child holds a stuffed animal, antenna up, the small speaker crackling out a storm advisory nobody needed, because the storm was already there. The porch light was on. The house lights were off. They had put him out and gone to bed. I came up the walk and my father opened the door before I could knock, as though he'd been waiting to explain himself. "Faye, it's not what it looks like," Roy said. "There's a wait list at Sage Meadows. We're just—" My mother appeared behind him in her robe. "We set him by the curb so the transport van could find him easily," she said. "In the morning. In a thunderstorm. At 10 p.m. I asked how long he'd been outside. Roy looked at the floor. Linda lifted her chin. "He's not our problem anymore," she said. "We did our part." "There's no van," I said. "There's no Sage Meadows. There's just an 80-year-old man sitting in the rain." Nobody answered me. So I stopped talking to them. I walked back down the steps, crouched in front of my grandpa, and placed my hand over the cold radio. "Hey," I said. "Let's get you out of here." He looked at me. And for a man my mother had called confused all month, his eyes were perfectly clear. "Take care of me," he said. Quiet. Not a plea, more like he was passing something across. I got his bags. I got him into the truck. As I buckled him in, the porch light went off behind us. We drove away from that house in the dark, the radio still crackling softly between us. My apartment was 800 square feet and not designed for 2. I gave my grandpa the bedroom and took the pull-out couch. That first night, I peeled him out of wet clothes, got him into one of my old company t-shirts, and tucked him in with extra blankets while the radiator clanked through the wall. He didn't complain. Harold never complained. He sat on the edge of my bed at midnight, carefully drying that ridiculous radio with a dish towel, making sure it still worked. It still worked. By the second day, I had reorganized my entire life around him. I made a spreadsheet. I'm a software engineer. Spreadsheets are how I love people. His medications, his blood pressure schedule, his cardiology appointments, the foods that didn't upset his stomach. I moved my contract calls to early morning, so my afternoons belonged to him. I told myself it was temporary. Just until things settled. Just until my parents came to their senses. They never called. My brother did. Dale's text arrived on the 3rd day. "Don't make this a thing, Faye. Mom and Dad had their reasons. He's a lot to handle." I stared at it for a long moment. A lot to handle. The man weighed 150 pounds and asked for nothing. I didn't write back. I just looked over at the closed bedroom door, at the thin line of light beneath it, and listened to the soft static of the radio. He kept on low all night so the apartment wouldn't feel so empty. I had no idea how I'd afford the cardiologist on contract income. I had no idea how long temporary was going to stretch. What I knew was simpler than a plan. I was not sending him back. Whatever it cost in money, in sleep, or in my own stalled life, I was not sending him back. Here's the thing about people who do something ugly in private. They work twice as hard at appearing decent in public. Within a week, my mother had constructed a story, and she told it to everyone. She told it at church. She told my aunts over the phone. She told the cousins on the group thread I was somehow still included in. We did everything for Harold, she'd say. We took him in. We cared for him. And Faye swooped in and took him just to score points. We're absolutely heartbroken. My Aunt Carol called me, her voice measured and cautious. Honey, she said, your mother's beside herself. Why did you take him without even telling them? I told her the truth. The porch. The rain. The bags. There was a silence on the line. Then Carol said the thing that told me exactly which direction the family was going to lean. Well, you know your mother exaggerates, but she wouldn't just put him out. She's not like that. People believe the version that lets them keep loving who they already love. I understood that. I even forgave it. But it meant I was completely on my own. My mother had a 30-year head start at being the sympathetic one, and I'd just lost a company and moved a sick old man into a studio apartment. On paper, I looked like the unstable one. You always did love playing the martyr, Faye. My mother said that the one time she called that month, not to ask how he was doing, but to ask whether Grandpa had mentioned the ranch money. Not how he was feeling. Whether he'd mentioned the money. I told her he was resting and hung up. Then I sat on my pull-out couch and did the math on a cardiology copay I couldn't cover. And I laughed, because the alternative was the other thing, and I'd promised myself I wouldn't do the other thing in front of him. I broke down and called my parents once. Not for myself, for him. His blood pressure medication had jumped to $240 after the cardiologist adjusted the dosage, and a contract had just fallen through. So I swallowed every remaining ounce of pride and called the people sitting on $1.2 million to ask them to split a prescription for the very man that money was supposed to be caring for. My mother answered on the fourth ring. I laid it out flatly. No drama. Just numbers. There was a pause. Then she delivered it in a tone so reasonable, it took me a full second to feel the blade. We took care of him, Faye. The transfer cleared. I asked her what that meant. It means we fulfilled our part, she said. We accepted the responsibility. We received the money. That chapter is closed. He's your project now. Your project now. As though a person were a freelance assignment I'd decided to pick up. I didn't argue. Arguing with my mother was like wrestling smoke. You came out exhausted, filthy, and holding nothing. I simply said okay, hung up, and stood in my kitchen for a quiet moment. And that's when the full shape of it finally clicked. To my parents, that $1.2 million was never a trust. It wasn't even truly a payment. It was a buyout. They had cashed the check and considered their father settled, paid off, closed, done. The promise was nothing more than a receipt to them. Take care of me had been answered by the transfer cleared, and in their private ledger, the books were balanced. I went and checked on my grandpa. He was awake, propped up against the pillows, the radio murmuring softly beside him. You okay, kid? He asked, because somehow he was the one checking on me. Never better, I said. He didn't believe me, but he let me have it. What I hadn't anticipated was that he'd begin trying to repair my life while I was consumed with preserving his. It started quietly. He'd watch me hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table, debugging someone else's inventory system for $90 an hour, and he'd ask, "What happened to your own thing?" My own thing had been a soil moisture sensor network. Inexpensive probes, a compact weather model, software that told a farmer exactly when to irrigate and when to wait on an approaching front. I'd built a real product. I'd simply run out of money before the market could notice. It died, I told him. Too expensive to manufacture. Nobody would pay what it needed to cost. He picked up his chipped blue mug, the one I'd quietly packed from the ranch kitchen without asking, and turned it slowly in his hands. Good tools earn their keep, he said. So make a cheaper tool. I told him it wasn't that straightforward. He said, most things people call complicated are just expensive. And most expensive things are simply refusing to start over. Then he began asking real questions. How does the probe detect moisture? What's the most failure-prone component? Why does a rain sensor cost more than the rain itself? By the end of the week, we had a notebook dense with his blocky pencil sketches, a man who'd read the sky for 51 years, methodically redesigning my hardware around the one instrument he had always trusted, that warm weather radio. "We can pull the leading edge of a storm cell off the public band," he said, tapping it. "Why are you paying for satellite data?" He was right. I had been paying for satellite data. That was the first afternoon in over a year I'd worked on my own idea instead of someone else's bug. Around 4 o'clock, I noticed I'd forgotten to feel sorry for myself. He noticed too. He didn't say a word. He just refilled the mug. People ask me how I managed all of it on contract income. The honest answer is, I didn't. Not fully. I sold my car and bought a cheaper one. I rearranged everything that could be rearranged. And I simply refused to send him back. If you've ever quietly carried something heavier than your bank account for someone who would have done exactly the same for you, without keeping score, comment "I see you," and subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. Because it does not end where you think. We rebuilt the prototype around his radio in the second month. The night it finally worked, he told me about the storms. The probe was now communicating with the weather band, pulling pressure data off the same public frequency he'd been listening to since before I was born. When the small screen flashed its first correct rain warning, he laughed out loud, a sound I had heard perhaps 4 times in my entire life. Then he went quiet in the good way. And he began telling me about the ranch, not the land. What was underneath it? He told me about the wells that came in dry, and the one that didn't. He told me about a man in a suit who'd arrived in 1979, offering to lease the mineral rights, and how everyone in town agreed that Harold was a fool to sign because nothing was down there. He told me he'd kept the radio on every storm season for 51 years because weather was the only completely honest thing on the ranch, the one thing that could not deceive you or quietly change its mind. I asked what eventually came of the 1979 man. He just smiled and said, "The land was never just dirt, Faye." The same line as the empty fence line. This time it sounded less like wisdom and more like a fact he was deciding whether to finally share. He didn't share it. He set the radio on the nightstand and said something that should have caught my attention far more than it did. "I need you to drive me somewhere next week. There's someone I've put off seeing for too long." I asked who. He said, "Somebody who keeps things in writing." Then he turned out the light. The radio crackled low into the dark, and I lay on my pull-out couch wondering who keeps things in writing. He began getting tired in the 3rd month, in the way that fatigue doesn't announce itself. He slept later. He'd drift off mid-sketch, pencil still resting in his hand. The chipped blue mug would sit on the table going cold, only half finished. And that, more than anything, frightened me, because Harold Anderson had never once in his life let a cup of coffee go to waste. I scheduled his appointments closer together and told myself the cardiologist would have an adjustment, another dosage, another solution. I picked up 2 additional contracts to cover the visits and survived on 5 hours of sleep. Then I snapped at a client and lost that contract too. And I told no one because there was no one to tell. That was the trap I was living inside, the one you can't recognize from within. I had built my entire identity around being the one who handles things. And handling everything alone had quietly become its own brand of pride. I wouldn't ask my aunts. I wouldn't ask Dale. I wouldn't have asked my own reflection for a glass of water. So I simply absorbed it, all of it, until my hands trembled slightly in the mornings. One afternoon, my grandpa watched me sort his pills into the daily organizer with my jaw locked tight, and he reached over and stilled my hand. "You're doing the thing," he said. "What thing?" "The thing where you carry it so nobody sees the carrying." I told him I was fine. He gave me that slow smile. "So am I," he said, which we both knew was a lie. And somehow that made it easier. 2 liars at a kitchen table, quietly refusing to be sad together. That night he asked again about the appointment. "Next week, I promised." He nodded, closed his eyes, and his breathing went slow and even. I sat up for a while, watching the thin line of light under nothing, listening to him sleep. I found it while sorting his medications. He'd asked me to refill his pill organizer from the bag of bottles he kept in the nightstand drawer. When I pulled the bag out, something slid free with it and landed on the floor, a sealed envelope, the heavy cream kind, with a small printed appointment card paper clipped to the front. The envelope had a name and address embossed in the corner. Margaret Ellison, attorney at law, estate, and trust. The card had a date and a time 11 days out. And below it, in handwriting that wasn't my grandfather's, a single note. Bring the key. I sat back on my heels and held it. I didn't open it. I want you to understand that, because I've turned it over in my mind 100 times since. The man had surrendered $1.2 million and been left out in the rain. His granddaughter, broke, exhausted, found a sealed envelope from an estate attorney in his nightstand drawer and did not open it. It didn't even tempt me. Some doors a person opens on his own terms. I clipped the card back on and slid the envelope into the drawer exactly where it had been. When I reached in to put the bag away, I realized he was watching me from the bed. He'd been awake the entire time. He looked at the drawer, then at me. Then his hand rose to his collar and closed around the brass key on its leather cord, the way you hold something you are finally ready to use. "You'll drive me Thursday," he said. Not a question. I said I would. I didn't ask what was in the envelope. I didn't ask what the key opened. I simply memorized the date, the 11th day, 11 a.m., Margaret Ellison, and held it in the back of my mind like a stone carried in a coat pocket through everything that followed. Thursday, I drove him into town to a low brick office building with Margaret Ellison's name on a brass plate beside the door. He had dressed for the occasion, a pressed shirt, his good boots, the patched ones left at home. He lifted the brass key from around his neck in the truck and held it closed in his fist the entire walk-in. I offered to circle back and collect him. He said, "Sit." So I sat in the waiting room with a styrofoam cup of weak coffee and watched the clock. 53 minutes. When the door finally opened, he emerged steadier than he'd entered, the way a man moves when he's finally set down something he's been carrying for a very long time. The attorney walked him out. Margaret Ellison, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up into iron gray hair, a handshake that meant something. She looked at me a beat longer than a stranger typically would, then asked if I was Faye. I said I was. She gave one firm nod, as though that confirmed something she'd already expected, and told my grandfather she'd handle the rest. In the truck, he buckled himself in and stared out at the parking lot for a long, quiet moment. "I fixed something I should have fixed years ago," he said. I asked him what. He turned the brass key over in his fingers, then slipped it back beneath his collar. "You'll find out," he said. Same as always. That was Harold's entire philosophy in 3 words. You'll find out. I started the engine. I wanted desperately to push, to ask what the envelope contained, what the key had opened, what he'd corrected, and why now. But his eyes were already closed and his face was tipped toward the sunlight coming through the windshield. For the first time in months, he looked like a man genuinely at peace. So I gave him the quiet, and I drove us home. Dale arrived the following weekend. My brother is 38 and underwater. A house flip in Odessa that went sideways, a second mortgage, and a tone of voice that's always hovering halfway toward asking for something. He brought a gas station bouquet and a wide smile and the transparent intentions of a man who has already done the arithmetic on a dying relative. He sat with Grandpa for 10 minutes, talking mostly about himself, then found me in the kitchen. "So how's he doing?" "Really?" Dale said, and I understood that really meant financially. I said he was tired. Dale lowered his voice. "Listen, somebody should have power of attorney for his protection. I think it should be family. Me, Mom, and Dad. Keep it simple." I told him my grandfather managed himself just fine. Dale's smile thinned. "Faye, there's stuff you don't know about. He's got assets nobody's tracking. If he goes without it sorted, it becomes a mess for everybody." I asked, "What assets?" He looked at me like he'd revealed too much, then waved it off. "The ranch money," he said. "Mom and Dad's money." But the word that snagged was assets. Plural, like there was considerably more than the $1.2 million. I filed it away alongside the stone already in my pocket. After Dale left, I checked on Grandpa. He'd heard every word through the thin wall, of course. "Your brother wants my signature," he said. I told him nobody was getting his signature that he didn't choose to give. He chuckled, low and dry. "Oh, they'll get a signature," he said. "Just not the one they're after." I asked what that meant. He patted the radio on the nightstand the way you'd rest a hand on an old dog. "Turn this up, would you? There's weather coming." And there was. 3 days out on the long-range band. the first spring storms rolling up from the Gulf. Though by the time they arrived, everything had already shifted. The last fully good night we shared was a Sunday. He felt strong. He ate a real dinner. He sat up at the kitchen table while I soldered a new probe lead, the radio playing a baseball game low in the background. He watched my hands work for a while. Then he spoke. "The thing I've kept folded up and carried ever since," he said, "is that you never once asked me what was in it for you." I looked up. He was turning his mug slowly on the table. "Your parents, the day of the wire. Your brother last weekend." The first question out of every one of them was always, "What's in it for me? You've had me 3 months. You sold your car. You haven't asked once." I told him there was nothing to ask about. He shook his head slowly. "That's the whole thing, Faye. That is the entire thing." I didn't know what to say. So I said the true thing, the small, plain one. "I didn't take you in for a reason. I took you in because it was you." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he took my own 3 words and turned them back toward me, gently, like closing a book he'd been reading for a long time. "You did take care of me," he said. Past tense, deliberate. "I made some joke about the job not being finished yet. Eat your vegetables." And he let me have it. But something had settled in him, a stillness I mistook for peace, and only later understood was a man arriving somewhere he had been heading for a very long time. He went to bed early. I tucked the blanket around him and turned the radio down, not off the way he liked. At the door he said, "Good night, kid." I said, "Good night, Grandpa." Those were the last ordinary words we exchanged. I didn't know that then. He may have. I'm going to tell you what the lawyer read aloud in that room, and I promise you, it is worth the wait. But first, if you have an aging parent or grandparent, and you have never once put your care arrangement down in writing, let this be your sign. A handshake is not a plan. A cleared transfer is not a contract. Comment noted if you needed to hear that today. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because this is where everything turns. He didn't wake up on a Wednesday morning. I knew before I opened the bedroom door. The way you know a house is empty the instant you step inside. He'd gone in his sleep, sometime in the small hours, with the radio still murmuring on the nightstand and the chipped blue mug rinsed and turned upside down on the drying rack, exactly where he'd left it the night before. He had washed his own mug. 80 years old, 3 months removed from a porch in a thunderstorm, and the last thing he did on this earth was rinse his cup so I wouldn't have to. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The radio kept talking, a calm, unhurried voice reading out a marine forecast for a coastline 400 miles away, for boats neither of us would ever own. At some point I reached over and turned it off, and the apartment went so completely silent I couldn't bear it. So I turned it back on. Then I did the things you do. I called the doctor. I called the funeral home. And then, because they were his family, and it was the decent thing, even when they had long since forfeited any claim to decency, I called my parents. My mother picked up. "Mom," I said, "Grandpa passed last night." There was a silence on the line. And then, "I will carry this until the day I die." The first words out of my mother's mouth were not grief. They were a question, quick and bright and reaching. "Oh," she said. "Oh, Faye, has anyone called the lawyer? Has anyone called the lawyer?" Her father was 4 hours gone, and her first instinct was the estate. I told her I had to go and hung up. The radio crackled. I made myself a cup of coffee in his mug, and I let it go cold, just to understand how that felt. The funeral was where my mother gave the performance of her life. She wore charcoal gray and wept precisely on cue at the front of the chapel, dabbing beneath her sunglasses, accepting the steadying arms of every cousin who came to comfort her. "We took such good care of him," she told the receiving line again and again, until the line itself believed it. "We did everything we could." At the end, he just wanted to be with family. People nodded. People held her hands. My Aunt Carol shot me a look across the room that said, "See? She's devastated. How could you have ever thought otherwise?" I stood off to the side in a black dress I'd bought for a startup pitch I never delivered. And I said nothing, because there is no winning a grief contest against a woman willing to cry at her own crime. Dale gave a eulogy about the virtue of hard work that was somehow, predominantly, about Dale. My father didn't speak. Roy sat in the front pew with his hands folded between his knees and his eyes fixed on the floor. Twice I watched him glance toward the casket, then look sharply away, like being seen looking was its own kind of wound. That was the first fracture I noticed in him. I filed it away. After the service, as the crowd began to thin, a woman with iron-gray hair moved up the aisle toward me. Margaret Ellison, in a navy suit, a leather folder tucked under her arm. She offered her condolences simply and sincerely. Then she handed me a card with a date and time written on the back. "The reading of the will," she said. 10 days out. My office. She held my gaze. "Your grandfather asked that everyone be present in the room." Everyone. Then she did something unexpected. She glanced once across the chapel toward my mother, looked back at me, and gave a small, deliberate nod. The private kind, the kind that means I know something you don't yet. The 10 days before the reading had their own slow, accumulating weight. My mother's version of events hardened into family fact. Faye took advantage of a confused old man. Faye isolated him from his loving son. Faye is after the estate. The particular irony of that last one, coming from the woman whose very first words over her father's body had been about the lawyer, could have powered a small city. The cousins took sides. Aunt Carol called to gently suggest that perhaps I should step back and let the family handle the estate matters and not make a scene. A scene. I had made a casserole every night for 3 months. I had lost 2 contracts and a car. My mother had wept in a chapel, and that was grief. I had refused to send an old man back into the rain, and that was a scene. I didn't argue. Not because I was a saint. I wanted to scream the truth into the group thread until my voice gave out. I refused because I had watched my entire family spend 8 months demonstrating that the loudest version always wins, and I had decided I was not going to fight on their terms. Let them talk. The talk wasn't the verdict. The talk was just noise. "I'm not going to defend myself over a man I actually showed up for," I told Carol. And I hung up before she could frame my composure as another offense. In the quiet apartment, I kept his radio on. I kept his mug on the windowsill. And I kept the brass key, because 3 days after the funeral, sorting the last of his belongings into a donation bag, I had found it lying loose in the nightstand drawer, no longer on its leather cord. Resting on top of a folded slip of paper in his blocky pencil handwriting. "Give this to Margaret," it said. So I would. 10 days felt like a year. The storm on the long-range band kept building. The morning of the reading, I did something that probably sounds strange. I put his weather radio on the passenger seat of the truck and buckled it in. I know how that looks. I'm an engineer. I don't believe a radio carries a soul. But I had driven him to that lawyer's office once already with that thing crackling between us. And I was not about to make the last drive with the seat empty. So, radio riding shotgun, antenna up, reading out a severe thunderstorm watch for the entire county. The storm we'd been tracking for days, finally arriving. The brass key was in my coat pocket, wrapped in his pencil note. I had spent 10 days turning over what it might open. A safe, a deposit box, a drawer in some office that had been his all along, and arrived nowhere. I parked outside Margaret Ellison's low brick building as the first heavy drops hit the windshield. My parents' Buick was already there. So was Dale's truck, the one he couldn't afford. I sat for a moment with my hand resting on the radio's warm plastic casing. Whatever's in there, I told it, like an idiot. Like a grieving idiot. We did our part. Then I switched it off. The cab went still. I picked up the key and the note, and I walked inside to find out what my grandfather had spent his last clear afternoon putting into writing. The waiting room smelled of rain and toner. My mother sat with her ankles crossed and her chin lifted, already wearing the expression of a woman about to be vindicated. Dale bounced his knee. My father sat slightly apart from them, staring at the carpet. When I entered, he looked up, and his face held something I couldn't quite read, something caught between dread and apology, and then he looked away. While we waited to be called in, my mother couldn't contain herself. She never could. She leaned toward my father and said it just loud enough for the entire room to absorb. "Well, there's not much to read, is there? The man gave it all away to us. Us. Like a small flag planted on freshly claimed ground." Dale gave a soft, knowing snort. "Probably just the truck and that junk radio," he said, glancing at me, having watched me carry it inside. Let me tell you what they believed, walking into that room. because it matters enormously for what happened next. They believed the $1.2 million had been the entirety of Harold Anderson. They believed they already held the money, free and clear, the arrangement complete. They believed today was a formality, the reading of a brief will left by a frugal old rancher, distributing whatever modest odds and ends remained, and that the only open question was whether I might reach for the mug and the radio out of sentiment. They had no idea. Not one of them. They had spent 30 years standing on top of something and calling it dirt. The inner door opened. Margaret Ellison stood in the frame, navy suit, leather folder, reading glasses pushed into her iron-gray hair. She looked at each of us in turn, and her gaze settled on me last. "Harold updated everything 8 weeks ago," she said. The entire room went motionless. 8 weeks. My mother's composed smile flickered at its edges. 8 weeks ago placed it squarely after the porch. After the rain. After he had moved into my 800 square feet and begun sketching sensors at my kitchen table and asking quietly, who keeps things in writing? Updated everything. Margaret stepped back and held the door open. "Please," she said. "He asked that I read it with all of you present." He was very clear about that. We filed in. The rain struck the windows hard. The conference room was small. A long table, 8 chairs, a window running with water, a metal credenza against the far wall. My Aunt Carol and one of the cousins had come as well, as witnesses Margaret had apparently arranged for. We settled into our seats, my mother and father on one side, Dale beside them, me directly across, the relatives at the far end. Margaret took the head of the table. She set down the leather folder and beside it, something else, a long gray metal lockbox, the drawer kind, which she lifted carefully onto the credenza. It had a small keyhole. I felt the brass key in my coat pocket as though it had suddenly grown heavier. "Before I read the document," Margaret said, "your grandfather left an instruction." She slid a folded note across the table to me. I opened it. His pencil. His handwriting. "Faye, open it when she asks. The key is yours." So I stood. I walked to the credenza. With every eye in that room trained on me, I took out the brass key on its worn leather cord and fitted it into the lock. It turned as though it had been waiting 51 years. Inside the drawer was a single accordion file, thick and labeled in his blocky hand, "The Land." I carried it to the table and set it in front of Margaret. My mother's voice came out then. "What is that?" Margaret opened the file, settled her reading glasses onto her nose, and looked slowly around the table over the top of them. "This," she said, "is what Harold Anderson actually owned." And the atmosphere in that room shifted before she had read a single figure. Margaret read it plainly. No theater, no build-up. Which, for them, made it considerably worse. In 1979, she said, Harold Anderson severed the mineral estate from the surface of his ranch and signed a mineral lease that the rest of the county considered worthless. It was not worthless. For 46 years, those minerals had produced, slowly at first, then steadily, then substantially, after new wells came in across the basin. Harold had never spent a single dollar of it. He had let it accumulate in accounts and conservative holdings he managed entirely alone, in complete silence, patching his boots, rolling his windows down, drinking coffee from a chipped blue mug he washed by hand. When he sold the surface of the ranch the previous year, Margaret explained, he had sold only the dirt. He had kept what was underneath. She turned the account statement around so the table could see the bottom line. The mineral estate and its accumulated proceeds had been valued, as of 8 weeks ago, at just over $20 million. $20 million. The number settled in the center of that table like a stone dropped through still water. Dale made a sound as though he'd taken a blow. My mother said, "That's impossible," in a voice stripped completely of its confidence. Carol's hand rose to her mouth. And my father didn't look at the statement at all. He was looking at the accordion file. At the words "the land," written in his own father's pencil. And his face had gone the color of ash. The land was never just dirt. I heard it in my grandfather's voice as clearly as if the radio sitting in the truck had carried it inside. He had told me twice, once at the empty fence line, and again the night the prototype first worked. Both times I had half listened, busy failing at my own life. My mother recovered first. Predators always do. Fine, she said, gripping the table's edge. Fine, but we have the $1.2 million. That's settled. That was his gift to Roy. Margaret let her finish. Then she drew a single page from the file and laid it flat on the table. About that, she said. Harold documented the transfer of the $1.2 million within this estate plan. He recorded it not as a gift and not as payment for care, because no caregiver agreement was ever formally signed. He recorded it as an advance against Roy's share of the estate. An advance. My mother didn't fully grasp the word yet. I watched comprehension arrive in stages across her face. Margaret made it plain. It means the $1.2 million has already been counted. It comes off the top of what Roy was designated to receive. There is no separate gift. She ran her finger down the page. And under the terms Harold signed 8 weeks ago, after deducting that advance, the remainder allocated to Roy Anderson is. She turned the page around. The figure beneath Roy's name was small. Smaller than the truck Dale couldn't afford. Margaret looked up. Then she read one line from the document, in my grandfather's own words, because he had asked her to read it exactly as written. A cleared check is not the same as a kept promise. I heard my mother's own voice return to her across 8 months and a grave. The check cleared. We did our part. And I watched that entire defense dissolve against a single sentence. She had built her whole case on a receipt. And my grandfather, from inside a folder labeled in pencil, had just informed the room that he had never once accepted that receipt as settlement. Then Margaret came to me. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, which was almost nothing. A high, clean ringing, the kind that follows a very loud sound. The residue of the estate, she read, after the advance to Roy and modest bequests to others, including a fund Harold directed be established, passes in trust to his granddaughter, Faye Anderson. She named the figure. I didn't absorb it. I was holding the edge of the table and the brass key, still warm from my hand. Margaret set down the statement and reached for the cream envelope, the one I had found in the nightstand drawer 11 days earlier and never opened. He asked me to read this to you, she said. All of you. At the end. She unfolded the letter. It was brief. He had never wasted a word in his life. To the ones who got the check, he had written, I hope it spends well. I gave it to you on purpose. I wanted to see what a man does when he believes the money is already his and the old man is simply weight. Now I know. To Faye, you didn't open the envelope. I watched you put it back. You never once asked what was in it for you. Not once. Not on the hardest night. And that is the only true measure of a person I have ever trusted. The land was never just dirt, kid. Neither were you. Take care of it the way you took care of me. I didn't cry in that room. I had promised myself I wouldn't do the other thing in front of them, and I held that promise the way I had held the other one. But I placed my hand flat on the accordion file, on the word land, written in his pencil, and I left it there. That was when my mother came apart entirely. She rose from her chair with both hands pressed to the table. She manipulated him, my mother said, her voice climbing. A sick, confused old man, 8 weeks before he died. She got into his ear. She turned him against his own family. This is undue influence, and I will contest every single word of it. Margaret didn't blink. The video record of Harold's capacity assessment is in the file, she said. 2 physicians. He was found fully competent. You're welcome to contest it. My mother turned on me instead. After everything I surrendered for this family, she said. 30 years. And you steal it out from under us with a soldering iron and a sob story. Her face was wet. But it wasn't grief. It was fury wearing grief's clothing. And everyone remaining in that room could finally see the distinction. Dale had his head buried in his hands, doing arithmetic on a number that was never going to arrive. Carol had gone completely still and was looking at my mother the way you look at someone you are seeing clearly for the very first time after 30 years of blurred vision. And my father. Roy made a sound. Small. Fractured. He was staring at the letter in Margaret's hands, eyes red and brimming, and his lips moved. What came out was a single word. Dad. Just that. For one brief moment, I believed he might rise. Might say the true thing. Might break in the right direction. He looked at me. I looked back. Then my mother said his name, Roy sharp as a slap. And my father closed his mouth, dropped his eyes to the carpet, and remained exactly where he had been for 30 years. Take care of me. He had asked only one thing of only one person. And it wasn't the one who held the check. I stood up, not because I had prepared a speech. I hadn't. I stood because I was finished sitting, and because the steadiest presence in that loud, fractured room was me, and I intended to keep it that way. My mother was still speaking. Something about lawyers, something about how this was far from over. I waited until she ran out of momentum. Then I said the only thing I had. I'm not going to fight you, I told her. I'm not going to contest anything, argue with anyone, post anything online, or call the cousins. Grandpa already said everything, and he said it in writing. I'm simply going to do what he asked. She stared at me, waiting for the blow that would allow her to become the victim once more. I didn't give it to her. You had an arrangement you never put into writing, I said. I had a man I never sent back. That is the only difference. It was always the only difference. I picked up the accordion file and the brass key and gave Margaret a nod. She returned it. I moved toward the door. I stopped, because there was one final true thing, and it cost me nothing to say. He washed his own mug the night he died. I said to the room, to my father most of all. So you wouldn't have to. Then I walked out into the hallway. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice rise once more and break against the silence of everyone who had once believed her without question. I kept walking, out past the smell of toner, through the glass door and into the rain. Here's what the money did and what it didn't do, because catharsis is cheap and consequences are permanent. My parents kept their $1.2 million. It had already been considerably diminished. A new Buick, a kitchen renovation, the down payment on Dale's failed property venture. But the advance designation meant nothing further was coming, and the $20 million they had assumed was theirs by bloodline had never existed within their reach at all. They didn't contest. Margaret quietly raised the matter of the capacity assessments and the second physician, and the will to fight drained out before it could form. Dale had to confront his own debt without a windfall to absorb it. Last I heard, he was letting the truck go. The cousins who had nodded along so agreeably at the funeral went quiet. Aunt Carol called me a month later, and the very first thing she said was, "I'm sorry, Faye." I accepted it because it was easier, and because I believed her. The version of my mother that had governed our family for 30 years, devoted, deprived, devastated, did not survive that conference room. People had watched her stand over the word land in her dead father's handwriting and call her own daughter a thief. You cannot walk that back with charcoal gray and a pair of sunglasses. She had said on a rain-soaked porch, "He's not our problem anymore." She was right in the end. Just not in the way she had intended. None of them were my problem anymore. I was the one holding the file labeled the land, and the brass key, and a letter I will keep until they lay me down beside him. I'd love to tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I drove home through the storm with his radio, reading out the all clear as the last cells moved east. I sat in the parking lot until the rain passed. And I felt the very specific, quiet grief of having won something I would have traded back without hesitation for one more mediocre cup of coffee with a stubborn old man. It's been a year. I did what he asked. The trust funded what he and I began at my kitchen table, the inexpensive soil and storm sensor, redesigned around his Warren Weather radio. The one that reads an approaching rain off the public frequency, so a farmer doesn't have to purchase the sky. We sell it now at a price a real working farm can actually afford. Which was always his entire point. Good tools earn their keep. The fund he wrote into the will, I run that too. It's modest and deliberately specific. It helps families who cannot afford professional care keep an aging parent at home, rather than out on a porch in the dark. We call it the Herald Fund. No plaque. No gala. Just rent covered and prescriptions filled for people that the check-clearing kind of family decided were no longer worth the trouble. His radio sits on my workbench. Still on. Still murmuring weather forecasts to a room that mostly ignores it. The chipped blue mug holds my pens. The brass key hangs on a nail beside the door. Some mornings I touch it on my way out. The way he used to turn it over slowly in his fingers. He still opens something worth opening. He was right. It opened a drawer, and a number, and the truth. but mostly it opened the part of me that had quietly stopped believing that showing up for someone counted for anything at all. A transfer can clear in a single moment, and people will tell you that settles the account. But keeping a promise takes the rest of your life. And in the end, that is the only ledger anyone reads aloud, in a room that goes completely silent. That's my story. One stormy night. One sentence, take care of me. And a will that finally made it right. If this reminded you that love is something you do, not something you wire, take it as a sign. Call the person who once showed up for you, while you still can. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, pass it along. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.